The wind howled like a living thing, a beast born of ice and hunger. Snow swirled in thick sheets, erasing the landscape, swallowing the world whole. Eleanor Whitmore tightened her grip on the reins, her fingers stiff with cold, her heart hammering in her chest. She should have waited, should have planned, but patience had never been her virtue, and the walls of Black Hollow had been closing in too fast. The town had already buried her alive. She would rather die in the storm than spend another year suffocating under the weight of expectation. The horse beneath her moved anxiously, its breath steaming in the bitter air. It had been bred for the frontier, but even the strongest of beasts had their limits. Ice crusted its mane, its hooves slipping in the rising drifts. Eleanor urged it forward, leaning low, eyes narrowed against the stinging wind. She had planned to ride west, toward the river, where the trading posts were fewer and the roads less traveled. There she could find passage further still, anywhere but Black Hollow. But the storm had other ideas. The gusts came in violent bursts, rattling her bones, clawing at her cloak. Visibility was gone. Landmarks disappeared. Her heartbeat became the only rhythm she could trust, a desperate pounding that matched the horse's faltering steps. She had underestimated winter's wrath, and then it happened. A sudden shift beneath them, the ground uneven, a patch of ice where there should have been snow. The horse let out a shrill cry, its legs buckling. The world tipped sideways. Eleanor barely had time to throw out her arms before she was falling, the impact knocking the air from her lungs. Snow swallowed her whole, cold and blinding, pressing against her like a great white weight. Darkness flickered at the edges of her vision. The wind screamed above her, but beneath it something else moved, something quieter, something watchful. Her body ached, her limbs sluggish. She tried to push herself up, but the cold was stealing her strength. Her lashes were heavy with ice. The snow clung to her like hands, pulling her down, whispering promises of sleep, of surrender. But then, footsteps. Slow, deliberate. Not the hurried steps of a man caught in the storm, but something else. Something that did not fear the cold. A shape emerged from the storm, tall and broad, more shadow than man. Snow clung to him, yet he moved through it as if he belonged to it, his steps sure, effortless. Eleanor blinked, struggling to focus, and then he was there, crouching beside her. Rough hands gripped her arms, lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all. She tried to struggle, to demand who he was, but her lips were too numb, her voice lost to the wind. Dark eyes met hers, depthless, unreadable. And then the world tilted once more, and she knew nothing at all. She woke to warmth. It should have been impossible. The last thing she remembered was the cold biting deep, the knowledge that she had made a terrible mistake. But now heat curled around her, the scent of burning wood filling her lungs. Her fingers twitched against the thick fur draped over her, coarse and heavy. A fire crackled somewhere nearby. Her eyelids felt leaden, but she forced them open, blinking against the dim glow. She was not in Black Hollow. The walls were rough-hewn, logs, the floor covered in pelts. Shadows danced along the low ceiling, the flickering light revealing shelves lined with dried herbs, tools, and weapons. An axe leaned against the far wall, its edge gleaming in the firelight. And then she saw him, the man from the storm. He sat on the other side of the fire, sharpening a knife with slow, practiced movements. His coat was heavy, lined with thick fur, and his hands, large, scarred, moved with the certainty of someone who had spent his life with a blade. She shifted beneath the blanket, and instantly his dark eyes flicked up, locking onto hers. Awake. The I. Word was not spoken, but she felt it all the same. Eleanor swallowed, her throat dry. "Where am I?" Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. He didn't answer. Just kept sharpening the knife, the rhythmic scrape filling the silence. She pushed herself up, muscles protesting. The fur slid from her shoulders, and the chill in the air sent a shiver down her spine. "Who are you?" Still, nothing. Frustration flared, cutting through the lingering haze. "I need to get back to town." A long pause. Then finally his voice, low, rough, like distant thunder. "Storm's not done." Her jaw tightened. "I can manage." Another scrape of metal on Stone, then without looking up, "No, you can't." The certainty in his tone sent a prickle down her spine. He had seen what she had not, that she was moments from death when he found her, that without him she would not have woken at all. She exhaled sharply, wrapping her arms around herself. "You live out here alone?" A small shift of his shoulders, not quite a nod. The people of Black Hollow spoke of him in whispers. Rowan Hale, a ghost of a man. He came to town only when necessary, trading furs and supplies in silence. Some claimed he was a criminal, hiding from justice. Others swore he had blood on his hands, that he had done things no good man would do. But Eleanor had never seen him up close before. Now, as she studied him across the firelight, she saw what the town had never bothered to understand. He was not a man hiding. He was a man watching, waiting. For what, she did not know. Outside, the wind still howled, but beneath it, another sound reached her ears, low, distorted by the storm. Her long, drawn-out howl. Wolves. She had heard them before, but this was different. A call, an answer. Not just hungry beasts searching for prey, but something more deliberate. Her gaze flickered back to Rowan. He had gone still, the blade in his hands forgotten. His eyes, sharp and assessing, turned toward the door. The silence stretched. Then, with slow certainty, he set the knife aside, rose to his feet. Eleanor watched as he moved, each motion precise, controlled. He took a rifle from the wall, checking it with the ease of long familiarity. The firelight caught the metal gleaming along its surface. The wind screamed against the walls, a second howl. Closer, she swallowed. "They're just wolves." Rowan's gaze met hers, something unreadable in the depths. "No," he said simply. Then, without another word, he crossed the room and stepped outside into the storm. The door swung shut behind him, cutting off the fire's warmth, leaving Eleanor in a space thick with silence. The wind raged outside, but her pulse was louder, a steady, insistent drumbeat beneath her ribs. Something about the way he had moved, unhurried but purposeful, unsettled her. He hadn't braced against the cold, hadn't hesitated. He had. Simply gone. She threw off the heavy fur and swung her feet to the ground. The floor was cold, but she barely felt it. Pushing herself up, she hesitated only a moment before following. The storm met her like a living force, the wind slamming against her, stealing her breath. Snow curled through the air in swirling veils, making the trees beyond little more than looming shadows. Rowan stood a few paces away, rifle in hand, gaze fixed on the darkness ahead. She followed his line of sight, but saw nothing. Only the forest, dense and unmoving. Then the sound came again, not a mere howl, but something deeper, a resonance that made the air shiver. Eleanor swallowed hard. "They're just wolves." Rowan didn't turn. "No." The weight of that single word pressed against her, stirring something uneasy in her chest. He didn't sound afraid. He sounded like a man facing an inevitability, her fingers curled into fists. "You act like there's something else." A pause. "Then they are." The rifle barely moved, but she saw the way his grip adjusted, the way his body settled, ready. Whatever he was waiting for, he knew it was coming. She wanted to press him, to demand answers, but something held her back. A feeling, a quiet instinct that whispered she didn't want to know. Then the trees shifted. A shape moved between the trunks, low, sleek, impossibly fast. Then another. And another. Her breath hitched. They were circling. Not mindless beasts drawn by hunger, but something more deliberate. Calculating. Rowan exhaled slowly, a breath of patience and certainty. "They're testing." She barely heard. Him. Her focus was locked on the movement, on the way they weaved through the storm like shadows given form. Then she saw their eyes, silver, almost luminous in the darkness. One shape broke from the rest, moving closer. Larger than any wolf she had seen, its coat was thick with winter, its head held unnervingly high. It did not lunge, did not snarl. It only stared. Rowan raised the rifle. Eleanor barely had time to react before the wolf moved. It didn't charge, it disappeared. A blur of motion, faster than any animal should be. Rowan fired. The crack of the gun shattered the night, the flash of fire briefly illuminating the snow. A yelp followed, sharp and short, but before Eleanor could see the result, another shape leapt from the side. Rowan pivoted, impossibly quick, but this one wasn't aiming for him. Eleanor had only a heartbeat to register its approach before the weight of it slammed into her, knocking her backward. The world tilted, her back hitting the ground hard, the air rushing from her lungs. Teeth flashed. A hand seized the wolf by the throat. "Rowan!" He tore the creature away from her, throwing it aside with a strength that was almost unnatural. The wolf hit the ground but landed in a crouch, snarling. Rowan stood between her and the pack now, rifle discarded, his breath steady despite the fight. The leader of the wolves, if that's what they were, let out a low, rumbling growl. Rowan lifted his chin slightly. "Not yet," he said, voice calm but edged with warning. The wolf stilled. A long moment passed, thick with something unspoken. Then, as quickly as they had come, the wolves turned and vanished into the storm. Eleanor lay where she had fallen, breath coming hard, heart hammering against her ribs. She felt the cold creeping into her bones, but she barely noticed. Rowan stepped forward, offering a hand. She hesitated, then took it, letting him pull her up. His grip was firm, warm even through the cold. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Rowan retrieved his rifle, then turned back toward the cabin. Inside, the fire was still burning. The heat wrapped around her, but it did little to ease the tension in her limbs. She watched as Rowan set the rifle aside, moving with the same unhurried certainty he always did. She needed answers. "You knew they would come." Her voice was steadier than she expected. Rowan didn't look at her. "Yes." "You didn't seem surprised." He ran a hand through his dark hair, exhaling. "Because I wasn't." She crossed her arms, frustration tightening in her chest. "You're not going to explain, are you?" A long silence stretched between them. Then finally he turned to face her. "You should leave when the storm breaks." Eleanor stared at him, searching for something in his expression that would tell her what he wasn't saying. "Why?" "Because you don't belong in this," she frowned. "In what?" His jaw tightened. "A fight that isn't yours." She felt the sharp edge of his words, the warning woven into them. But something inside her rebelled at the idea of walking away. "I don't run," she said quietly. Rowan held her gaze for a moment longer, something unreadable in his expression. Then, without another word, he turned back to the fire. Eleanor sat down on the edge of the cot, pressing her hands together to stop the tremor she wasn't ready to acknowledge. The wind had not lessened outside, and she knew, deep in her bones, that the wolves would return. She also knew that whatever had happened tonight was only the beginning. The fire burned low, its embers pulsing like a heartbeat in the dim cabin. Eleanor sat with her back straight, her hands pressed together in her lap to keep from fidgeting. The silence between them had grown thick, weighted by unspoken things. Rowan sat across from her, his gaze steady, dark eyes unreadable beneath the flickering light. She had seen many men in her life, merchants, lawmen, preachers, but none had unsettled her the way he did. He was not like them. He carried no badge, no title. The people of Black Hollow feared him, whispered of his isolation as if it were a sickness. But now, after what she had witnessed, she knew the truth. They did not fear him because he was alone. They feared him because he was different. Her voice came quieter than she expected. "What are they?" Rowan didn't answer right away. Instead, he reached for a worn leather strap near the fire, pulling a whetstone from its folds. With slow, methodical movements, he ran it along the edge of his knife, the rhythmic scrape filling the space between them. The blade caught the light, its surface worn with use but impossibly sharp. She waited, refusing to let him ignore the question. Finally, he exhaled, setting the knife down with careful precision. "You wouldn't believe me." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "Try me." A flicker of something passed through his eyes, something like hesitation, but then it was gone. He rested his elbows on his knees, hands clasped. "They are not just wolves." She had known it, felt it, but hearing him say it sent a shiver down her spine. "Then what are they?" Rowan's jaw tightened, his gaze drifting toward the window, where the storm still howled. "Hunters," he said finally, "not of men, but of something older." The air in the cabin felt heavier. Eleanor swallowed, pressing for more. Older than what? He turned his gaze back to her, and for the first time since she'd met him, she saw something crack in that impenetrable exterior. It wasn't fear. It was something deeper. Weariness. A weight that had settled on his shoulders long before she had stumbled into his world. Before there were towns, before men put borders on maps, there were others who walked this land, he said. Not men, not beasts, something in between. His fingers flexed slightly as if measuring his words. Their kind ruled the wild long before we did. They kept to themselves, unseen, untouchable, until something changed. Eleanor barely breathed. What changed? His expression darkened. A war. The words settled like a stone between them. A long time ago something came through, he continued. Something worse. It hunted them the way they hunted everything else. It did not stop, it did not die, and when it was done only a few remained. Those that survived, scattered, became something less than what they were. His gaze flickered back to the fire. But not all of them faded. A cold realization crept over Eleanor's skin. The wolves, Rowan nodded slowly. They aren't just testing me. They are searching for weakness. They know I am the last. She barely processed the words before her mind latched onto something else. The way he moved, the way his wounds healed faster than any man should, the way the wolves had tested him, not her. Her breath caught. You're one of them. His gaze didn't waver. No. But you're not... She stopped, struggling to put it into words. Rowan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his face before answering. I am what's left. The words carried an emptiness that made her chest tighten. He wasn't just alone. He was the last of something. She shook her head, trying to piece together what it meant. You've been fighting them all this time? A muscle tensed in his jaw. It is what I was meant to do. She didn't know what to say to that. For years she had thought of running, of escaping a town that had never felt like home, but now she saw her life for what it had been. Small. The petty judgments of Black Hollow seemed meaningless compared to what sat before her now. A man who had carried a burden longer than she could imagine, who had never run, never wavered. Something hot and angry burned inside her. Why does no one know? Rowan gave a dry, humorless chuckle. Would you have believed it? She had no answer for that. The wind rattled the cabin, a sharp gust shaking the wooden frame. Eleanor stared into the fire, letting the heat chase away the cold that had settled deep in her bones. What happens now? His voice was quieter this time. You leave when the storm ends. A sharp protest rose in her throat, but he cut her off before she could speak. You don't belong in this, he said, his tone firm. You have a life in town, a future. Eleanor scoffed. You think I can go back to playing the obedient daughter after this? He didn't answer. He didn't need to. She pushed herself up, pacing now, the weight of everything pressing down on her. If you're the last, who fights when you're gone? Rowan said nothing. The realization hit like a punch to the ribs. That's why they're testing you, she murmured. They want to know if you're strong enough to stop what's coming. A long silence stretched between them. Then Rowan leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. Go back to Black Hollow, Eleanor. The finality in his voice sparked. Something reckless in her. She turned to face him fully, chin lifting. No. His brow furrowed slightly, as if he hadn't expected that answer. I won't go back, she said, stepping closer. Not when I know what's coming. Rowan sighed, running a hand through his hair. It isn't your fight. But it's yours, she shot back. And if you fall, who stops them? He studied her for a long moment, the firelight casting shadows across his sharp features. Finally he shook his head, muttering under his breath. Stubborn, she crossed her arms. Adaptable. A ghost of a smirk flickered across his lips, but it vanished just as quickly. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. You don't understand what this fight takes. Then, show me. The words surprised them both. Rowan's gaze hardened. It isn't that simple. Eleanor met his stare unflinching. You think I'm weak. His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. I think you don't know what you're asking for. She stepped forward, closing the space between them. Then tell me, show me. Give me a reason to go back, because right now Black Hollow feels like a cage, and I'm not walking into it again. The fire crackled, casting gold against the worn lines of his face. He was still for a long time, his expression unreadable. Then finally he exhaled. You really want to know? Eleanor nodded. Rowan reached for his knife, not in threat, but in offering. Then let's begin. The night smelled of ice and blood. Eleanor ran, her breath sharp in her chest, her fingers tight around the hilt of Rowan's knife. The snow had slowed, but the air was thick with the promise of something worse, something inevitable. The storm had never been the real threat. It had only masked what lurked beneath, what waited for the right moment to strike. That moment had come. Rowan was ahead, moving through the trees with unnatural speed. His rifle was slung across his back now. Bullets wouldn't be enough for what was coming. He had warned her of this, had told her to stay behind. She had ignored him. The town was close. She could see the faint glow of lanterns through the thinning trees, the scent of smoke drifting on the wind. Black Hollow was still asleep, unaware of the danger creeping toward it. Then the sound came again, a low guttural howl so deep it seemed to vibrate in her bones. It wasn't alone. Another joined it, then another. The wolves had come. Rowan stopped at the tree line, his body rigid, listening. The air was too still, the kind of silence that only came before something terrible. Eleanor slowed beside him, her pulse hammering. How many? He didn't answer. A single lantern burned on the front porch of the sheriff's office. The rest of the town lay in darkness, quiet, defenseless. Then, movement. At first, she thought it was only the wind stirring the snow. But then the shadows shifted, peeled away from the edges of the buildings. Eyes gleamed in the dark, silver and predatory. They were already here. Rowan tensed. They're waiting. She swallowed, forcing herself to stay steady. For what? He turned his head slightly, just enough for her to see his expression. Grim. Certain. For me. As if summoned by his words, the first wolf moved. It was larger than the others, stepping into the lantern's glow with slow, deliberate ease. Its coat was thick, black as the night, its eyes glinting like polished steel. It did not snarl, did not lunge. It simply watched. Eleanor could feel its intelligence, its purpose. This was no ordinary animal. Rowan's voice was low. Stay behind me. She ignored him. A second wolf emerged from the darkness, then a third. The air filled with their presence, a pressure that pressed against her lungs. They were surrounding the town, cutting off escape. Then the leader moved, not toward Rowan, toward the sheriff's office. Eleanor's breath caught. The sheriff, the people. They would die before they understood what was happening. Rowan didn't hesitate. He moved, faster than any man should be able to, crossing the open street in an instant. The wolf turned, just as Rowan struck, the blade in his hand flashing in the lamplight. The beast dodged unnaturally quick, but Rowan was quicker. His knife found its mark, cutting deep along its side. The wolf snarled, stumbling, but it did not fall. Eleanor had no time to watch. Another shape lunged from the darkness, rushing her. She ducked, the instinct sharp and immediate. The wolf's breath was hot as it snapped at empty air, but she didn't freeze. She turned with it, slashing outward. The blade met fur, met flesh. The wolf yelped, retreating. The rest did not. They attacked. Chaos erupted. Rowan fought like something out of a nightmare, his movements precise, lethal. He did not hesitate, did not waste motion. Every strike was meant to kill. Eleanor fought beside him, moving on instinct, on the fear that kept her sharp. She had never killed before, but she did not falter. These were not animals. They were something else, something worse. The first body hit the snow, then another. But the pack did not scatter, because this was not a battle, it was a test. Rowan realized it at the same time she did. He turned, blood smeared across his knuckles, his breath steady despite the fight. His eyes locked on hers, dark and knowing. "They're waiting," he murmured. The words settled like ice in her stomach. Waiting for what? Then the ground shuddered. A sound deeper than before filled the air. It was not a howl. It was something else. A summoning, a command. The pack retreated, melting into the shadows, not running, reshaping. Rowan's grip on his knife tightened. "It's here." Eleanor felt it before she saw it. The air thickened, the night pressing closer. The lanterns flickered, the wind dying. Then, from the darkness beyond the town, something stepped forward. It was shaped like a wolf but larger, taller than a man. Its limbs elongated, its fur matted with frost. Its eyes, ancient and hollow, locked onto Rowan with something that was almost recognition. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the knife. "What is that?" Rowan did not look, away from it. "The reason I was left behind." The creature moved, each step deliberate. Rowan took a slow breath. Then, without another word, he lunged. The impact sent them both crashing into the snow. Rowan's blade sank into flesh, but the creature did not cry out. Its massive hand slammed into his chest, sending him skidding across the ground. Eleanor ran forward, heart pounding. The knife in her grip felt too small, too human. The creature turned toward her. She moved before she could think. Its strike came fast, but she ducked, rolling beneath its reach. She lashed out, the blade cutting across its leg. It staggered but did not fall. Then Rowan was there. He did not hesitate. He moved behind the creature, driving his blade deep, twisting. For a moment nothing happened. Then the beast let out a sound that was not a roar, not a howl, but something older. It fell. Silence rushed in. Eleanor stood frozen, her breath ragged. Rowan pushed himself to his feet, his face unreadable. The remaining wolves were gone, the fight was over. For now. The town was still standing. The people would wake in the morning, unaware of how close they had come to being nothing more than memory. Rowan looked at her, the weight of the night still heavy in his gaze. She met his stare, unflinching. "You told me to leave," she murmured. His lips pressed into a thin line. She lifted her chin. "I'm not going anywhere." Rowan studied her for a long moment. Then, finally, he nodded. The storm had passed, but winter was far from over. Ayanna knelt among the wild sage, fingers brushing against the soft petals of prairie flowers. She moved with quiet grace, plucking what was needed, her dark eyes scanning the horizon with instinctive caution. The land was both home and danger. Beautiful, but never without its threats. Not far from her, Niall sat atop his painted horse watching her. His muscles tensed as he scanned the distant hills, every fiber of his being attuned to the world around him. The Comanche did not survive by ignoring their surroundings. He had seen too many fall to the steel and fire of encroaching settlers, to the greed of men who saw their land as something to be carved apart and sold. But today he watched only her, allowing himself a rare moment of peace. Ayanna had always been strong, even when she was a child chasing the wind through the tall grass. He remembered the first time he had promised to protect her. She had skinned her knee running after a wild colt, and though she bit back tears, he had seen the pain in her face. He had whispered then, as he had whispered many times since, "No harm will ever come to you while I am here." It was a promise he had carried in his heart like a sacred vow. The cry of a hawk shattered the silence. Niall straightened, a cold shiver running down his spine. Something was wrong. He urged his horse forward just as Ayanna turned toward him, her brow furrowing at his expression. Then came the gunfire, sharp, cracking like a whip against the pea. "Silence!" Ayanna gasped as men erupted from the brush, their faces smeared with dust and greed. Horses thundered behind them, the ground trembling beneath their charge. Niall's heart pounded as he pulled his bow from his back, loosing an arrow before the first man could reach her. The bandit fell with a strangled cry, his body crumpling. Into the dirt. "Ayanna, run!" Niall bellowed, leaping from his horse, unsheathing his knife. She turned, her feet digging into the earth, but hands caught her arms before she could flee. She fought, twisting violently, her nails raking across a sun-scarred face. The man cursed, backhanding her hard enough to send her staggering. Niall surged forward, blade flashing, driving deep into a raider's ribs. A second man swung at him. With a rifle stock, he barely dodged the wood grazing his temple. Blood blurred his vision, but he struck again, feeling bone snap beneath his grip. The world became a blur of movement, fists, hooves, shouts blending into the wild song of battle. Niol reached for Ayana, their fingers brushing, but a lasso snapped around his throat, yanking him backward. He hit the ground hard, gasping as rough hands wrenched his arms behind him. The leader stepped forward, boots sinking into the dust. He was a mountain of a man. His face a patchwork of scars, eyes cold as river stones. Colton Briggs, a name spoken in whispers, a name that meant death. "Well now," Briggs drawled, rolling a cigarette between his fingers. "Ain't every. Dare you catch a Comanche warrior fighting like a cornered wolf?" He crouched beside Niol, pressing a boot against his chest. "You're a real scrapper, ain't you?" Anishol spat blood at him. Briggs chuckled, shaking his head. "I like your spirit, boy, but here's the thing." He turned his head toward Ayana, who still fought against the men holding her. "I got something you want, and I ain't in the habit of giving things back." Niol thrashed against the ropes binding his wrists, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "You let her go," he growled. Briggs only smiled. "See, I don't think I will." Ayana's eyes met Niol's, wide with fear, but she did not plead. She did not cry out. She only held his gaze as if trying to tell him something without words. "Let's go, boys," Briggs ordered, climbing onto his horse. "We got along." "Ride ahead, and I don't want to keep our buyer waiting," Niol roared as they dragged Ayana onto a horse, her wrists bound. The last thing he saw was her dark hair whipping in the wind as they galloped away. Then came the pain. The rifle stock crashed into his skull, and the world went black. Night fell like a burial shroud, the only sound the whispering wind across the empty plains. Pain dragged Niol back to the waking world. His skull throbbed with a dull, relentless ache, and the taste of copper lingered on his tongue. Darkness had settled over the land, stretching its cold fingers across the plains. He lay in the dirt, bound and beaten, his breaths slow and measured, as he fought through the haze clouding his mind. Then he remembered. Ayana rage struck through him like a blade. His eyes snapped open, scanning the empty landscape. They were gone. The outlaws. Her. Only hoofprints and churned-up earth remained, marking the violent struggle that had torn her from his grasp. With a guttural growl, he rolled onto his side, testing the bonds at his wrists. They were tight, but not unbreakable. He twisted, flexing his fingers, straining until the rough fibers bit into his skin. Gritting his teeth, he forced himself to breathe through the pain. He would not fail her. He could not. A sharp tug. The rope loosened. He twisted again. Another pull. Then, freedom. He surged to his feet, swaying for only a moment before his balance returned. His knife was gone, his bow lost, but none of that mattered. He still had his mind, his body, his rage. He would track them, hunt them like the wolves. He had watched since childhood, and he would not stop until he had her back. Dropping to one knee, he pressed his fingers against the disturbed earth. The tracks were fresh, the indentations deep. They were riding hard, but speed would not be their ally for long. Horses tired, men grew careless, and he had nothing to lose. He moved swiftly, each step calculated, each breath steady. The night was his ally, the stars his silent witnesses. He followed the trail north into the rocky terrain where shadows stretched like reaching hands. Hours passed, but exhaustion did not touch him. His body ached, his wounds throbbed, but his mind remained sharp. Every broken branch, every scuffed rock told him their path. He pushed forward, relentless, unstoppable. A rustling in the brush made him halt. He dropped low, pressing himself against the cool earth. His eyes narrowed. The sound was too controlled, too deliberate to be the wind. A shape emerged from the darkness, moving like a phantom through the trees. A man, lean and weathered, with the sharp, calculating eyes of a predator. A rifle rested easily in his hands, and the moonlight caught the jagged scar that ran from his temple to his jaw. Niol did not move. The man studied him, tilting his head as if weighing his next words. Then, in a voice rough as gravel, he said, "You're following the wrong trail." Niol's muscles coiled, ready to spring. He had no time for games. "Who are you?" The man let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. Someone who knows better than to let vengeance cloud judgment. He gestured toward the tracks. They've doubled back west. You keep going north, you'll be wasting your time. Nioli studied him, searching for deceit, but the man's expression remained unreadable. His instinct screamed not to trust him. But if the outlaws had changed course, if Ayana was being taken farther from him, he could not afford pride. Who? "Ayu?" he repeated. "Elijah Harper," the man answered. "Ghost to those that matter. A name half-whispered in trading posts and frontier towns. A tracker. A man who knew the land better than the men who claimed to own it. Some called him half Comanche. Others said he was born of no people, belonging only to the wild." Niol clenched, his jaw. "Why tell me this?" "Because I've seen what happens to people taken by men like Briggs." There was something dark in his voice, something heavy. "You want her back? You'll need more than bloodlust." Niol exhaled sharply, weighing his options. He had always been alone in his fights, always relied on himself. But Ayana was running out of time. He nodded once. Ghost studied him for a moment longer, then turned, stepping back into the brush. "Then keep up." Niol followed. They moved fast, weaving through the trees like wraiths. Ghost barely made a sound, his movements eerily smooth. Niol kept pace, his focus sharp. The stars shifted overhead, marking the passage of time. The air grew colder, the land rougher. Ghost slowed, raising a hand. Niol halted beside him. "Down there." Ghost gestured toward a distant fire flickering in the valley below. "That's where they're holed up." Niol's heart pounded. Ayana was there, so was Briggs. His fingers curled into fists. Ghost's voice cut through the silence. "Rushing in'll get you killed." Niol turned, eyes burning. "Then tell me what will keep me alive." Ghost smirked. "Now you're thinking like a warrior." The fire crackled below, oblivious to the storm coming for it. Ayana's wrists ached where the rope bit into her skin, her fingers numb from the tight bindings. The rhythmic sway of the horse beneath her did little to ease the tension in her muscles. Dust clung to her face, her lips dry and cracked, but she refused to show weakness. She held her head high as the outlaws rode deeper into the valley, their laughter grating against her ears like rusted steel. Briggs led them, his silhouette broad against the starlit sky. She could feel his eyes on her even when he wasn't looking, the weight of his gaze crawling across her skin. He had taken what was hers, her freedom, her choices, but he would not take her spirit. "You ride like a Comanche," Briggs called, back to her, smirking over his shoulder. "Guess that's to be expected." Ayana did not answer. She had seen men like him before, ones who thought cruelty was power, who took because they knew no other way to be. There was no use reasoning with a wolf that had tasted blood. One of the younger outlaws, a wiry man with a nervous energy, rode closer. Jeb, they had called him. His grip on the reins was too tight, his glances toward her uncertain. She caught him watching her with something that almost looked like regret. "She ain't gonna talk," Briggs muttered. "Comanche women don't beg." Ayana met Jeb's eyes just long enough to see the flicker of doubt. She stored that away, tucking it beside the growing fire in her chest. If there was even a sliver of hesitation in him, it could be pried open. The canyon walls closed around them, the land shifting from open plains to rugged stone. Their hideout loomed ahead, a cluster of makeshift buildings pressed against the rock face, the entrance framed by jagged cliffs. Ayana's breath slowed as she studied the terrain. There were 2 watchmen posted on the ledges above, rifles slung across their shoulders. A single path led into the camp, but there were likely other ways out, small crevices, forgotten trails that only the land itself knew. She memorized everything. As they rode in, the fire at the center of the camp flared, illuminating rough-hewn faces and hollow eyes. More men than she had expected, some drunk, some sharpening knives, some staring at her like she was already lost. She felt their hunger, the way they sized her up as something to be taken or sold. She clenched her jaw, pressing her bound hands against her thighs to keep them from shaking. Briggs dismounted, stretching as if he had merely finished a long day's ride instead of stealing a life. He walked toward her horse, reaching up to grab her chin between his fingers. She flinched, but she did not pull away. "You got fire in you," he said, grinning. "I like that." Ayana's heart hammered against her ribs. Slowly, deliberately, she spat in his face. The laughter around them cut short. A sharp silence fell over the camp. Briggs wiped his cheek, his grin vanishing. Then, without warning, his hand lashed out, striking her across the face. White-hot pain exploded behind her eyes, but she refused to fall. She swallowed the cry that clawed at her throat, lifting her chin in silent defiance. Briggs chuckled darkly, stepping back. "Put her in the cabin. We'll see how long that spirit lasts." Two men dragged her off the horse, shoving her toward a small wooden structure at the edge of camp. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing nothing but a cot, a dirt floor, and walls that pressed too close. They pushed her inside, slamming the door shut. The lock clicked into place. Darkness swallowed her whole. She exhaled slowly, blinking against the sting in her cheek. Her head throbbed where Briggs had struck her, but she ignored it. Pain was temporary. Pain was something she could endure. She had to. She moved toward the single window, its opening small but enough to see through. Outside, the outlaws drank, their voices rough and slurred. They believed themselves untouchable, convinced that no one would come for her. They were wrong. Somewhere out there, Niall was coming. She pressed her forehead against the wood, breathing in the cool night air that seeped through the cracks. He would find her. She would hold on to that belief until her last breath. A scuff of boots against the dirt caught her attention. A shadow passed across the window. Jeb. She turned slowly as the door creaked open. He hesitated in the doorway, his fingers twisting in uncertainty. "You shouldn't have done that," he muttered. Briggs, he ain't one to forgive. Ayana studied him. He was younger than the others, his face lacking the hardness that had settled into their bones. There was something unfinished about him, something undecided. "You don't belong with them," she said quietly. His jaw tightened. "You don't know nothing about me." "I know you hesitated when they took me." She took a step closer. "I know you haven't stopped looking at me like a person." His gaze darted toward the door. "Briggs'll sell you soon. Mexico, most likely. You'll never get back if that happens." Ayana's stomach twisted, but she kept her expression steady. "Then help me." Jeb exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I can't." "Not yet." She held his gaze, planting the seed of doubt deeper. A long pause. Then he turned and left, locking the door behind him. She sat on the cot, exhaling slowly. The moment had been brief, but it had been enough. Outside, the fire crackled, the voices of the outlaws fading into the night. Miles away, Niall crouched behind a ridge, his breath slow and measured. He could see the fire, see the shapes of the men who had taken her. His muscles coiled with tension, every instinct screaming for him to run straight into the camp and tear them apart with his bare hands. But he would not. Not yet. Beside him, Ghost watched, his expression unreadable. "Rushing. "And won't do her any good," he murmured, Niall's jaw clenched. He knew that. "We wait," Ghost said. "Watch. Learn." Niall swallowed hard, his fingers twitching at his sides. He had never been good at patience, but this was not just about him. This was about her. His eyes remained fixed on the fire below. He could not see her, but he felt her. "Hold on, Ayana." "I'm coming." The night lay heavy over the outlaw camp, the fire's glow flickering against the canyon walls. Shadows stretched long across the dirt, distorting the movements of the men who laughed and drank, their guard lowered in the lull of false security. The scent of whiskey hung in the air, mingling with the charred remains of a cooked hare, the embers of its fire barely alive. From the ridge above, Niall watched in silence, his body coiled with tension. His breath was steady, but his heart thundered, like distant war drums. He counted the men, 10, maybe 12 still awake, the rest sprawled across the ground in drunken stupors. 2 sentries on the cliffside, but their movements were sluggish, their rifles resting too loosely in their hands. A mistake, a weakness. Beside him, Ghost crouched low, his rifle slung across his back. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was firm. "They'll kill her the second they know we're here." Niall's fingers flexed against the hilt of his knife. Then they won't know. Ghost gave a slow nod, then slipped into the darkness. Niol followed, their footsteps soundless against the rock. Below, in the wooden shack where she had been locked away, Ayana pressed her ear to the door, listening. The camp had grown quieter, but she knew better than to believe that meant safety. Every minute that passed brought her closer to being sold, to being lost beyond the reach of anyone who could save her. She would not wait for that moment to come. The handle rattled suddenly, and she stepped back, her breath catching. The door cracked open, revealing Jeb's pale, nervous face. He lingered in the threshold, glancing behind him before stepping inside. "You need to go," he whispered. Ayana's hands curled into fists. "Unlock me." Jeb hesitated, his fingers fumbling with the bindings at her wrists. "If Briggs finds out, he will." Her voice was steel. "But not before I'm gone." Jeb swallowed hard and nodded, cutting through the rope with a blade from his belt. The moment she was free, Ayana took the knife from him, testing its weight. It wasn't much, but it was something. Outside, the night thickened, silence creeping into the camp. Ghost moved like a shadow, his blade quick and silent against the first sentry's throat. The man slumped forward before he could even gasp. The second turned, his mouth opening to sound the alarm, but Niol was already behind him. A sharp snap of bone, and he was dead before he hit the ground. They descended the cliffside in silence, the wind masking their movements. Every step was calculated, every breath measured. The outlaws sat clustered by the fire, oblivious. Then, from the cabin, a sharp cry. Niol's blood ran cold. The moment shattered. Briggs's roar cut through the camp. "She's loose!" Ayana burst through the door, knife flashing as she lunged at the nearest man. The outlaw reeled back, but not before her blade slashed across his arm. He howled, stumbling, but she didn't stop. She ran. Gunfire erupted. Niol moved before thought, his blade driving deep into the gut of the first outlaw who reached for his rifle. He twisted, yanking it free, and spun, firing into the fray. Ghost took down 2 men before the others even realized they were under attack. Chaos swallowed the camp, drunken outlaws scrambling for weapons, tripping over each other in the frenzy. Ayana darted between them, using the confusion to her advantage. She saw Niol through the smoke and gunfire, his expression dark and unrelenting. Their eyes met. Then Briggs was there. He grabbed her by the arm, yanking her back, his fingers like iron against her flesh. "Not so fast, girl." She twisted, slashing at him with the knife, but he caught her wrist and wrenched it hard, forcing her to drop the weapon. His other hand closed around her throat, squeezing. Niol saw red. He tore through the distance between them, his body colliding with Briggs like a storm unleashed. They crashed to the ground, rolling, fists flying. Briggs was bigger, stronger, but Niol was faster. Briggs landed a blow that sent pain crackling through his ribs, but Niol didn't falter. He struck back, his fist cracking against the outlaws. Jaw then drove his knee into his stomach. Briggs snarled, spitting blood. "You think you can take from me?" Niol didn't answer. He drove his knife into Briggs's side. The outlaw choked on his breath, his body jerking. Blood soaked into the dirt beneath them. The camp fell silent. The remaining outlaws stared at their leader's body. Realization sinking into their whiskey-dulled minds. Their will to fight dissolved. One by one they dropped their weapons, disappearing into the night like rats abandoning a sinking ship. Ayana stumbled forward, her hands reaching for Niol as he sagged against her. His breath was ragged, his body worn from the fight, but he was alive. Ghost stood over Briggs' body, nudging it with his boot before glancing at Niol. "Took you long enough." Niol exhaled heavily, his grip tightening around Ayana. She held him up as much as he held her. Jeb lingered at the edge of the chaos, eyes darting between the bodies, his chest rising and falling in short, panicked breaths. He had helped her. But he had also been part of this. He knew there was no place left for him now. Niol looked at him, then at Ayana. He didn't speak, but Ayana understood. "Go," she said softly. Jeb hesitated, then turned and ran, disappearing into the wild. The fire crackled in the silence. The camp, once filled with laughter and cruelty, was nothing more than a graveyard of men who had chosen the wrong path. Niall turned to Ayana, his fingers brushing against her cheek, against the bruise that still lingered from Briggs's strike. "You're safe," he murmured. She leaned into him, pressing her forehead against his. "Because you came." He closed his eyes. He had promised her once, long ago, that no harm would come to her while he was there. Tonight, he had kept that promise. Ghost adjusted the rifle on his back. "We should leave before the vultures come." Niall nodded, tightening his grip on Ayana's hand. Together they stepped away from the wreckage, the wind carrying the scent of death and smoke behind them. The plains stretched ahead, vast and untamed, whispering the stories of those who had come before. As they disappeared into the darkness, Niall spoke only one word: home. The air smelled of blood and smoke. The village was burning, and so was her future. Eleanor Hayes stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest as the acrid stench of charred wood filled her lungs. The screams had quieted now, fading into the war, night like dying embers, but the weight of their echoes remained. She clenched her fists, nails digging into her palms, as she fought against the nausea twisting her stomach. Somewhere in the haze of firelight and shadow, the dead lay still, and the living knelt with hands bound. The men who had once stood strong with rifles now stared at the ground, their defeat carved into their sun-worn faces. The women clutched, one another whispering prayers between broken sobs. Her father, Samuel Hayes, knelt at the center, hands roped behind him. Blood streaked his temple, his hat lost in the dust. He had fought, they all had, but it hadn't been enough. A figure stepped forward, the weight of his presence cutting through the ruin like a blade. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, his shoulders broad beneath the dark folds of his clothing. Long black hair framed a face that bore no sign of victory, only the heavy, unwavering stare of a man who carried more burdens than triumphs. Tohan, the war chief of the Navajo, he moved with the deliberate stillness of a predator who did not need to rush. His gaze swept over the fallen settlement, then settled on her father. His voice when he spoke was deep and measured. "This bloodshed is enough." Her father lifted his chin, though there was no defiance left in him. "And yet it is my people who have paid the price." A flicker of something unreadable passed through Tohan's eyes. He glanced at his men, then back to Samuel. "Your people have encroached upon sacred land, stolen water that is not theirs to take, and broken promises made in good faith. The time for mercy is past." Ellie's pulse hammered against her ribs. She wanted to scream, to tell him that not all settlers were guilty, that not all had come with greed in their hearts, but she could say nothing. Not now. Tohan turned slightly, his gaze locking onto her for the first time. A slow, measuring look. Not one of cruelty, nor of interest, just assessment, as if weighing the worth of a horse or a rifle. Samuel followed. His gaze, and Ellie saw the moment her father understood something she did not. His jaw tensed and his breathing grew uneven. "Take the land," Samuel said. "Take the livestock. Take everything. Just leave my daughter be." Tohan's expression did not change. "You misunderstand." Ellie felt the shift in the air before the words left his mouth, as though fate itself had paused to listen. "I will take your daughter," Tohan said, "and in doing so I will end this war." Silence fell like a blade through bone. Ellie recoiled, her breath catching. "No." Tohan did not flinch at her outburst. His gaze remained on her father. "A union between your blood and mine will bind us. A peace offering, one that cannot be undone by another lie, another betrayal." Her father's eyes darkened. "You ask for too much." Tohan tilted his head. "I ask for nothing. This is the price. Pay it, or lose everything." Ellie's breath came fast and shallow. No, this couldn't be happening. She would not be bartered like cattle given to a man she did not know, a man whose people had set her world to ruin. "I won't," she ground out, shaking her head. "I'd rather—" Her father turned to her sharply, his face worn with grief and fury. "You will." The finality in his voice struck her like a slap. She staggered back a step. "You can't do this." Samuel's eyes shone with something she had never seen before, desperation. "If I say no, they'll slaughter what's left of us." Her stomach twisted. He was right. Tohan held all the power. Refusing meant watching the remaining settlers Die at the hands of men who had every right to vengeance. Her hands trembled. A knife sliced through the ropes binding her father's wrists. He sagged but did not fall. Two warriors stepped forward, seizing Ellie by the arms. Her body went rigid as they pulled her toward Tohan. Her father looked away. The fire crackled, and the night swallowed her protests. She did not remember the ride to their camp. The journey passed in a blur of moonlight and dust, her wrists bound, her throat raw from silence. When they arrived, the settlement was nothing like the one she had left behind. There were no hard-edged cabins, no straight lines of fences carved into the land. The Navajo village breathed with the earth, round dwellings made of mud and timber, the scent of sage and cooking fires drifting in the wind. But Ellie felt no wonder, only dread. She was pulled from the horse and led toward the largest dwelling. Inside, the firelight cast long shadows, making Tohan's presence feel larger than it already was. He dismissed the others with a single glance, leaving her alone with him. She stood rigid as he studied her. "This is not what I wanted," she spat, her voice hoarse. "You think taking me will stop the war. My people will never accept this." Tohan's face was unreadable. "Your father accepted it." Anger flared in her chest. "Because you left him no choice." His dark eyes flickered, but he did not argue. Instead, he stepped closer. Not enough to touch her, but enough to make the space between them feel small. "You hate me," she glared at him. "Yes." His expression did not change. "That will pass." She let out a sharp, bitter laugh. "You're wrong." Tohan exhaled through his nose, as if he had expected no different. He turned and unfastened the knife from his belt, then extended it toward her, hilt first. Ellie stared. "What? You will not be bound," he said simply. "Not here. If you wish to fight, then fight. If you wish to leave, try." His voice lowered. "But know this. I will not harm you, and if you stay, you will not remain a prisoner." She hesitated. Slowly, she reached out and took the knife. Its weight was solid in her palm. Their eyes met. A challenge. A promise. Ellie tightened her grip around the handle, her heart beat loud in her ears. This was not surrender. This was the beginning. The key. Morning came slowly, casting a muted glow over the Navajo village. Ellie sat on the packed earth floor of the dwelling, knees drawn to her chest, gripping the knife Tohan had given her. She hadn't slept. Her thoughts had twisted in circles through the night. Escape, revenge, survival. But none of them led to anything certain. Outside, the village stirred to life. The murmur of voices, the clatter of tools, the distant bark of dogs. She should have been running. She should have used the darkness to flee, but where would she have gone? The desert was vast and merciless, and she knew nothing of its ways. The moment she left the boundary of the village, she would be nothing but a ghost waiting to die. The Ketiwam entrance flap shifted and Tohan stepped inside. His presence filled the space, quiet but commanding. He regarded her for a moment, dark eyes, unreadable. "You have not eaten," he observed. Ellie lifted her chin. "I'm not hungry." A flicker of something passed over his face, amusement perhaps, or pity. Without another word, he placed a small wooden bowl beside her. Stewed beans, some dried meat. It smelled better than anything she had eaten in days, but she refused to give in to hunger. He turned to leave, then paused. "You will learn to survive here." She swallowed back the sharp retort that burned on her tongue. Instead, she pressed her back against the wall and said nothing. Days passed in a slow, torturous rhythm. The people of the village avoided her, some glaring openly, others pretending she did not exist. She was an outsider, a ghost among them, and Tohan did nothing to force their acceptance. He expected her to find her own footing, though how, she did not know. She tried to help once. She had watched the women grinding corn outside their homes, and though she despised the idea of lowering herself to do their work, she knew it would be better than sitting in silence. She knelt beside them, reaching for a stone to grind the kernels, but the nearest woman, a sharp-faced elder, snatched it away with a glare. "You do not belong," the woman said in a language Ellie barely understood. The rejection stung more than she wanted to admit. She stalked away, anger curling in her stomach like a snake. If they would not let her work, then she would find another way to make herself useful. That night she tried to leave. She waited until the village had settled into stillness, until the fires burned low and only the distant howl of coyotes filled the silence. Slipping from the dwelling, she kept to the shadows, her breath tight in her throat. The desert stretched wide before her, endless and indifferent. She took her first step beyond the safety of the village, and then another. The air was cool against her skin, the ground hard beneath her feet. She never heard them coming. A hand clamped over her mouth, yanking her backward. She fought, kicking, twisting, biting, but the grip did not relent. She was dragged into the darkness, her heart slamming against her ribs. Then, just as suddenly, she was released. She stumbled, turning to find Tohan standing behind her, arms crossed. "You will die out here," he said, his voice calm, as though he had expected this. "I'd rather die free," she spat. Tohan tilted his head. "Death is not freedom." She glared at him, chest heaving. "Why do you care? Let me go." He studied her for a long moment. Then, instead of answering, he turned and walked away. Ellie hesitated, torn between rage and confusion, but she did not follow. She stayed where she was, her breath ragged in the quiet night. She did not try to leave again. The next morning, Tohan woke her early. Without explanation, he handed her a small bundle of supplies, dried meat, a water skin, a rough woolen cloak. Then, with nothing more than a nod, he motioned for her to follow. They rode in silence, away, from the village, deeper into the untamed land. The sun climbed higher, the heat pressing down like an iron weight. Ellie's throat turned dry, her limbs aching from the unfamiliar strain of riding for so long. Finally, Tohan stopped at a narrow riverbed, where the water ran low but steady. He dismounted and motioned for her to do the same. "This is where you will learn," he said. She frowned, brushing dust from her skirts. "Learn what?" "To survive," she scoffed. "I don't need your help." He gave her a long, considering look. Then he turned, walked to the river's edge and crouched. With practiced ease, he pulled a small knife from his belt and carved into the soft earth. Ellie watched as water trickled into the shallow channel he created, forming a small pool. "You see?" he said simply. "You must know where to look." Ellie clenched her jaw. She didn't want to be impressed. She didn't want to admit that. Had she left the village last night, she would have died of thirst within hours. But she said nothing. The lessons continued. Tohan showed her how to track small animals, how to find shelter in the rocks, how to listen to the wind and know when a storm was coming. Each day she resisted, and each day she learned in spite of herself. The first time she caught a rabbit, she nearly wept, not out of relief, but out of frustration. This was not supposed to be her life. She was not supposed to be here, skin burned by the sun, hands stained with the blood of an animal she had killed herself. Yet, when Tohan watched her from a distance, offering neither praise nor criticism, she felt something shift within her. One evening, as they sat by the fire, she found herself speaking without thinking. "How did you become chief?" Tohan looked at her, surprised by the question. He was silent for a long moment before answering. "My father was chief before me. He died when the soldiers came." Ellie swallowed. "I'm sorry." Tohan's gaze was steady. "And your mother?" She hesitated. "Died when I was young. It was just me and my father for most of my life." A small silence stretched between them, filled only by the crackle of flames. Finally, Tohan spoke. "You think we are different, but we are not." Ellie wanted to argue, but the words felt hollow. Instead, she looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time she saw something beyond the enemy she had forced herself to believe he was. She saw a man who had lost as much as she had. The next morning, everything changed. The attack came without warning. One moment she was kneeling by the river, filling her water skin. The next, the air was filled with the sharp cries of unfamiliar voices, the pounding of hooves. Apache. Tohan was already moving, pulling her up, shoving her behind him. The first arrow missed by inches, sinking into the dirt where she had just been kneeling. Ellie's heart slammed against her ribs. Tohan's voice was sharp, urgent. "Run!" But she didn't. She couldn't. Not this time. Instead, she grabbed the knife at her belt and turned to fight. The dust settled in the aftermath of the attack, the air thick with the coppery scent of blood and the acrid stench of burnt wood. The Apache raiders had been driven back, but not without cost. Tohan stood at the edge of the village, his dark eyes scanning the horizon, the tension in his shoulders refusing to ease. Ellie knew without asking that he blamed himself. She watched him, arms wrapped tightly around herself. In the chaos, she had fought. Not well, but well enough to hold her own. When the dust cleared, she had seen the way the others looked at her, not with acceptance, but with something quieter. Curiosity, perhaps even the beginning of tolerance. Tohan finally turned toward her. His face was unreadable, but something in his gaze lingered. "You fought well," she exhaled sharply. "I fought because I had no choice." He nodded, as if that were enough. Choice is an illusion in war. The words unsettled her, not because they were cruel, but because they felt true. She had never chosen any of this marriage, this war, this life. But in the end, had Tohan truly chosen either, a shadow fell over them as one of the village elders approached. It was Maka, the warrior who had always watched her with thinly veiled disdain. His presence was sharp, like a blade drawn but not yet used. "She must prove herself," Maka said without preamble, his gaze cutting to Ellie. "If she is to stay." Ellie stiffened. "I didn't realize I was still a prisoner." Maka did not blink. "You are not a prisoner, but you are not one of us." A muscle in Tohan's jaw twitched, but he did not argue. Instead, he turned to Ellie. "You must decide." She stared at him. "Decide what?" "If you will fight for your place here." It was not an order, not a demand, it was an offering. She looked around at the people who had ignored her, the ones who still whispered when she passed. A part of her wanted to turn her back, to let them hate her, but another part, one she barely recognized, felt something closer to defiance. "I'll do it," she said before she could talk herself out of it. The challenge was simple in theory, but brutal in practice. She had to prove she could survive without aid, that she could be useful to the village rather than a burden. Over the next week, she was given tasks she had once thought beneath her, gathering wood, fetching water, grinding corn. It was exhausting. And the women still barely acknowledged her, but she did not falter. The physical trials were worse. Maka did not go easy on her, forcing her to spar with the younger warriors, pushing her to the ground over and over again. Each time she got back up, bruised, bleeding, furious. But she rose. Tohan never interfered, but he watched. She felt his gaze like a weight, studying her, measuring her. The night she managed to knock one of the warriors off his feet, she expected silence. Instead, a murmur of approval rippled through the onlookers. She turned, breathless, and found Tohan standing. At the edge of the crowd, he nodded once. That night, she sat by the fire, muscles aching, hands blistered, and for the first time someone handed her a bowl of food without prompting. Acceptance was slow, but it was coming. She had barely begun to settle into this new reality when a rider arrived. From the east, her father's men. The moment she saw the familiar insignia on his coat, her stomach clenched. The rider did not enter the village. He waited at a distance, knowing better than to cross into Navajo land without permission. Tohan met with him outside the boundary, and though Ellie couldn't hear their conversation, she saw the way Tohan's posture stiffened. When he returned, his expression was carefully blank. "Your father is coming," he said. Ellie felt her breath catch. "For me?" Tohan nodded. "He comes with an army." Panic clawed at her chest. She had known, deep down, that her father would not accept this arrangement forever. But she had not expected war. "He won't listen," she murmured. "He'll think you forced me to stay." Tohan studied her. "Did I?" She hesitated. The answer was more complicated than yes or no. She had been forced at first, but now she wasn't sure. That night, she did not sleep. She sat outside, staring at the stars, trying to force her thoughts into something coherent. She heard him approach before he spoke. "You could still leave," Tohan said. She turned to look at him. And if I did? His expression was unreadable. Then I would not stop you. She searched his face, trying to understand him. You would let me go? A muscle in his jaw flexed. If that is what you want. She should have said yes. She should have taken the out. Instead, she whispered, "What if I don't know what I want?" The firelight flickered between them, casting long shadows. He took a step closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him. "You are no longer a prisoner," he said, voice low. "But if you stay, you must choose to stay." She swallowed hard. The words came before she could stop them. "If I stay, then we are truly married." Something shifted in his gaze, something she could not name. "Yes," she released a slow, shaky breath. "Then I stay." His hand lifted, hesitated, then brushed lightly against her cheek. A touch barely there, but it sent a shiver down her spine. For the first time, it was not obligation, it was choice. The horizon burned with the first light of dawn when the dust cloud appeared in the east. Ellie stood at the edge of the village, her breath slow and measured, her heart a relentless drum against her ribs. The approaching force was unmistakable. The settlers had come for her. She felt Tohan's presence beside her before he spoke. They will not leave without a fight. His voice was calm, but there was an edge beneath it, like a blade pressed against the skin. He had known this day would come just as she had. Yet standing here now with the weight of everything between them, the inevitability of war felt heavier than she had ever imagined. "My father won't listen," she murmured. "He'll see me standing here and think you forced me to stay." Tohan's jaw tightened. "Then he does not know his own daughter." Ellie turned to him, searching his face. The man she had once feared now stood as her ally, her protector, her husband in truth, if not yet in name. Somewhere along this impossible road she had chosen him, not because she had no other path, but because she could not imagine walking any other. She took his hand. His fingers curled around hers, warm, steady. Then, the first shot rang out. The village erupted into motion. Warriors moved swiftly, taking cover behind rocks and trees, bows and rifles raised. The settlers' forces thundered forward, a wall of men and horses, their weapons gleaming in the rising sun. Ellie did not cower. She reached for the rifle Tohan had given her and lifted it to her shoulder. Then she saw him, her father. Samuel Hayes sat atop his horse at the front of the charge, his face a mask of determination and fury. He did not hesitate. He raised his rifle, and the moment their eyes met, he fired. Tohan yanked Ellie down just in time. The bullet tore past her, so close she felt the heat of it on her cheek. The shock of it, of her father aiming to kill, sent a bolt of ice through her veins. She hit the ground hard. The breath knocked from her lungs, but Tohan was already pulling her up. "Stay low." She barely had time to register his words before the battle swallowed them. The settlers crashed into the village, their weapons roaring, their shouts mixing with the war cries of the Navajo. Chaos surged around her, bodies clashing, dust rising, in thick clouds. Ellie fired, the rifle kicking against her shoulder. A man fell from his horse. Another lunged at her, but she swung the butt of her weapon into his gut, sending him sprawling. Somewhere in the madness, she saw Samuel dismount, his gun raised, searching for her. Ellie's breath came in ragged gasps. Tohan met her gaze, understanding, flashing between them. "Go," he said. She didn't argue. She ran. She moved through the battlefield like a phantom, ducking behind burning structures, weaving through the chaos. She found her father near the trading post at the village's edge, his back to her, shouting orders to his men. She raised her rifle. "Stop!" she screamed. Samuel turned sharply, eyes wild, and for the first time his mask cracked. His grip on his gun tightened. "Ellie!" She swallowed hard, her hands trembling against the wood of her rifle. "You have to leave." His gaze darted. Over her clothes, her stance, the way she held the weapon with the confidence of someone who had learned to fight. His expression twisted, something between grief and rage. "You're coming home," he said. Her heart clenched. "This is my home now." Samuel's face darkened. "No. They've poisoned your mind, girl. Made you think you belong here." "I do belong here." His breathing hitched. Ellie, she took a step closer. Call them back, Pa, please, we don't have to do this. He shook his head. They murdered our people. And we murdered theirs, she shot back. You taught me to see the world in black and white, but it isn't. It never was. Pain flashed across his features. I did this for you. No, she whispered. You did this for yourself. A shot cracked the air. Tohan. Samuel flinched, raising his rifle, but Ellie was faster. She swung hers up, aiming straight at his chest, and for the first time in her life, her father hesitated. I won't let you kill him, she said, her voice steady. Samuel's grip faltered. For the briefest moment, she saw something deep in his eyes. Regret, maybe. A ghost of the man he had once been. Then behind him a settler raised his weapon. Ellie screamed. Tohan lunged from the side, driving his knife into the man before he could fire. The settler crumpled, but the movement shattered whatever moment had existed between father and daughter. Samuel turned his gun on Tohan. Ellie didn't think. She pulled the trigger. The shot echoed through the battlefield, louder than anything else. Samuel staggered backward. His rifle slipped from his fingers. Ellie watched, breath frozen in her chest, as her father, her protector, her enemy, the man who had raised her, sank to his knees. His mouth opened, but no words came. She dropped her gun and caught him before he hit the ground. His blood was warm against her hands. She pressed her forehead to his. I didn't want this. His fingers curled weakly around hers. For the first time in years, she saw his eyes soften. You're your mother's child, he murmured. Then his body went still. The battle had ended before she even realized. The settlers, leaderless, had begun to retreat, but Ellie didn't move. She stayed there, cradling her father's body, the grief tearing through her like a storm. Strong hands touched her shoulders. She knew it was Tohan before he spoke. I'm sorry, he said quietly. She turned, her vision blurred with tears. You tried to save him, he continued, but he made his choice. Ellie exhaled shakily, and so had she. In the weeks that followed, the dust settled. The settlers did not return. Ellie burned her father's body in the old way, the way he would have wanted. She did not speak as the flames consumed him, but she felt the weight of him lifting, leaving only embers behind. One night, as she sat outside, staring at the vast sky, Tohan joined her. He did not speak. He simply sat beside her, his warmth steady and sure. She turned to him, reaching out, fingers brushing against his. This time he did not hesitate. His hand closed over hers, solid and real. They did not need words. She had chosen this place. She had chosen him, and for the first time she felt free.